My older sibling seized control of our grandfather's antique restoration workshop and forbade me from even stepping onto the property. This is a premium studio now, not a hobby space, he told me. I stood there gripping my 9-year-old son Lucas's hand, staring through the bay windows as my cousin handled the delicate sanders. My aunt managed incoming pieces, and my niece wept mahogany shaving. For 3 years, I'd watch from the hardware store across the avenue, where I mixed paint for minimum wage. Every shift, I'd see delivery trucks pull up, smell the rich scent of varnish drifting over the asphalt, and watch my family's legacy operate without me. Mom, why can't we go see the clocks at Uncle's shop? Lucas would ask as we hurried past. The truth was too heavy for a kid. How Marcus had manipulated our fading grandfather into believing I had abandoned the old world techniques. How he'd brought a lawyer to the hospice facility those final days. How the sprawling workshop that was meant to be shared became his exclusive kingdom. 5 months ago, Lucas and I ran into Miss Harlan, the estate liquidator who used to supply grandfather with rare salvage. Marcus's recent French polishing is a disaster, he murmured, looking around cautiously. I bought an old textile mill on the edge of town. There's an empty room with heavy-duty ventilation if you want it, I scoffed. Pay you with what? I'm barely scraping by. He looked at me intently. Your grandfather restored my grandmother's heirloom vanity for free when I was bankrupt. I haven't forgotten. Take the space. Give me a cut when you start selling. Lucas squeezed my fingers. Mom, you still have great-grandpa's leather notebook. That evening, I pulled grandfather's battered journal from the single crate of his belongings Marcus had permitted me to keep. Buried in those faded pages were his masterful formulas, the custom stain blends and varnishing techniques he'd taught me during the quiet twilight hours before Marcus would bother showing up. A week later, I moved my tools into the mill. I bought a secondhand lathe using my tax refund. We started small, restoring salvaged side tables and wooden frames, displaying them at weekend antique fairs. Local dealers recognized the craftsmanship immediately. This feels exactly like Elias's work, one collector whispered, running his hand over a flawless cherry wood finish. Word spread like wildfire. By the third week, historical society curators were calling. Soon, I was in the mill past midnight just to keep up with commissions. Lucas would read comic books on a pile of moving blankets while I sanded. Then the tide really turned. A prominent interior designer offered me an exclusive contract for a boutique hotel. Your brother charges a fortune for rushed synthetic lacquers, she noted. Your pieces actually have a soul. The contrast was a bitter validation. Before long, my little corner of the mill was buzzing with serious buyers. Marcus's high-end clientele started vanishing. I could see it from the hardware store, where auction trucks used to line up. Now only clueless tourists brought in cheap thrift store chairs to be glued back together. The serious money had followed the real talent. One Tuesday, my aunt walked into my mill space during a delicate gold leaf application. Marcus demands a sit-down, she declared, refusing to look at my stunning completed pieces. He says you're being malicious, poaching his loyal client. I surveyed my busy workbench. My schedule was booked solid. 2 elite gallery owners were already waiting in the lobby. They weren't just customers. They respected the craft. Lucas carefully handed a client a receipt, exactly the polite way grandfather used to do it. Tell Marcus he can join the waiting list, I replied, turning back to my work. I require a deposit up front. My aunt's expression twisted in outrage. You are unbelievable. You're really going to act like what? I cut in, laying down my brush with deliberate precision. Like a woman locked out of her own grandfather's studio? Like someone erased from her family's history? She turned pale and walked out in silence. The very next afternoon, Marcus himself arrived. He stood awkwardly next to his imported sports car, the one financed by the business our grandfather built from scratch. He was clutching a shattered antique mahogany clock case he clearly didn't know how to fix. He didn't come inside right away. He stayed out by the curb for a full 2 minutes, looking up at the rusted brick facade of the textile mill, checking his reflection in the car window, adjusting the collar of his designer jacket. When he finally pushed open the heavy iron door of my workshop, the smell of turpentine and beeswax hit him. He blinked against the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. Nice place, he said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. A bit drafty, isn't it? I didn't stop working. I was mid-scrape on a late Victorian washstand, the old shellac coming off in long, brittle curls under my cabinet scraper. The ventilation is better than the old shop, I said, my voice flat. What do you want, Marcus? He set the clock case down on my clean assembly table, right on top of a fresh piece of blotting paper I'd laid out for some veneer repairs. The wood was an English long case clock, circa 1820, or what was left of it. The base was split clean through the grain, and someone had tried to use modern wood glue to force it back together. The yellow squeeze-out was smeared across the original patina like dried snot. It's Mrs. Vanderhoof, Marcus said, crossing his arms. The tall case from her summer home in Rhode Island. It took me 6 months to convince her to let us do the restoration. My guy tried to strip the lower plinth and the wood just gave up. Your guy didn't know that old mahogany gets brittle if it's sat next to a coastal heating vent for 40 years, I said, barely glancing up. And he used a chemical stripper that dissolved the original hide glue holding the mortise together. It's ruined. It's not ruined, Marcus snapped, his face flushing a mottled red. It's just a setback. I need you to subcontract it. Fix the base, redo the finish using grandfather's linseed oil reduction, and I'll give you 15% of the invoice. She's paying $9,000. I stopped scraping. The metal tool felt cold in my hand. I looked at him, really looked at him. He had a smudge of graphite on his cheek, likely put there on purpose to look like he'd been working, but his hands were soft. No calluses, no embedded stain under the fingernails. 15%, I repeated. You want me to fix a catastrophic blunder on a museum-grade piece, use the proprietary formulas you stole from me, and give you 85% of the profit for the the privilege. I own the name, Clara, he said, leaning over the table. Elias & Sons Restoration. That's the brand people trust. You're just a girl in a drafty warehouse working out of a tackle box. Without the name, you're a hobbyist. The name didn't stop you from ruining Mrs. Vanderhoof's clock, I said. Get it off my table. I have a Sheraton sideboard arriving in 20 minutes. He didn't move the clock. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. He slid it across the workbench toward me. It was a formal letter on thick, cream-colored bond paper. The letterhead read Vanderhoof Holdings LLC. Read it, Marcus said. I picked it up. It wasn't a standard restoration contract. It was a formal notice that Mrs. Vanderhoof was threatening a civil suit against Marcus's studio for the destruction of a documented family heirloom valued at $42,000. But that wasn't the part that made my stomach drop. Attached to the back was a copy of the original inventory receipt from our grandfather's record, dated 1994, when he had first appraised the piece for her late husband. Grandfather had signed it with his signature flourish, a little hand-drawn chisel next to his name. At the bottom of the new letter, typed in cold, legal type, was a clause stating that if the piece was not restored to historical authentication standard by the end of the month, the estate would also audit every single piece Marcus had delivered to their family over the last 3 years to verify their authenticity. She called the museum, Marcus muttered, his bravado suddenly cracking like old varnish. She had a curator from the regional gallery look at that sideboard I delivered last month, the one Aunt Jane sprayed with Polly. They know, Clara. They know it's not traditional. You lied to them, I whispered. I gave them a modern, durable finish, he argued, though his voice lacked conviction. Nobody has time for 30 coats of hand-rubbed shellac anymore. It takes weeks. It takes a month, I corrected him, which is what they paid for. Marcus leaned both hands on the table, his face inches from mine. If she sues, she audits. If she audits, the Historical Society pulls our certification. The shop goes under. And if the shop goes under, Aunt Jane loses her house. She put her equity up for the new spray booth Marcus bought last year. You think you're just hurting me? You're ruining the whole family. The guilt was an old familiar weight, but this time it didn't press me down. It just felt greasy. You did this, Marcus. You took the shop, you took the tools, you took the client. You even took grandfather's ledger from his desk before his body was cold. You wanted the kingdom. Now you get to govern the ruins. He stared at me, his jaw working. I'll give you 30%. No, 40. I don't want your money, Marcus. I want you to leave. He stood up straight, his face hardening back into the mask he wore when he told me I was banned from the property. Fine, have it your way. But remember this when Jane is living in a 2-room apartment on the south side. You could have saved us with 3 days of work, and you chose to be petty. He grabbed the broken clock case, shoving it back into its protect blanket with so much force that another small piece of the mahogany molding snapped off and rolled across my floor. He didn't even notice. He stormed out, the heavy iron door slamming hard enough to rattle the glass panes in my window. Lucas came out from behind the rack of drying timber in the back. He had a piece of 220 grit sandpaper in his hand, his small fingers gray with wood dust. He looked up at me, his eyes wide. Is Aunt Jane going to lose her house? He asked. I don't know, Bug, I said, kneeling down to pick up the broken piece of mold Marcus had left behind. It was a tiny dental section, beautifully carved by hand over a century ago. I don't think so. Your uncle tells a lot of stories, but the lie tasted bad in my mouth. I knew Aunt Jane. She was stubborn and small-minded, and she had stood by and watched Mark's bar me from the workshop without saying a word. But she was still the woman who used to bring me thermoses of hot cocoa when I was working late with grandfather in the dead of winter. She wasn't malicious. She was just weak. She followed whoever had the checkbook. The next morning, the hardware store clerk, Bobby, called me while I was boiling a fresh batch of hide glue on my hot plate. Clara? Bobby's voice was low, like he was hiding behind the paint mixer. Your brother's across the street. He's got 2 guys from the moving company loading up the big European oak refectory table. The one your granddad spent 3 years fixing. The one from the 17th century? I asked, my hand freezing over the glue pot. The one in the back showroom? Yeah. Some guy in a dark suit is watching them load it. He looks like a lawyer or a high-end appraiser. Marcus looks like he's about to throw up. I thought you should know. Thanks, Bobby. I hung up. I knew exactly what that table was. It was grandfather's masterpiece. He'd salvaged it from an old church renovation in Belgium back in the 70s. It wasn't for sale. It was the anchor of the shop's reputation. If Marcus was selling that table or using it as collateral, things were much worse than he'd admitted the day before. An hour later, my phone rang again. This time it wasn't Bobby. It was an unknown number with a local exchange. Clara Harrison? A woman's voice asked. It was sharp, crisp, and carried the distinct, unhurried cadence of old money. Yes, this is Clara. My name is Eleanor Vanderhoof. I believe you currently operate out of the old textile mill on Crane Street. My chest tightened. I do. I am currently looking at a very poorly executed repair on a grandfather clock that has been in my family for 4 generations, she said. The man who delivered it, your brother, I believe, claims that you were the one who performed the initial stripping process that caused the base to separate. He says you used an improper solvent before he took over the contract. The room seemed to shrink. The hide glue on the stove began to bubble, its pungent, organic smell filling the air. Marcus hadn't just asked for my help. He'd already set the stage to blame me for the destruction of the piece if things went south. Mrs. Vanderhoof, I said, my voice steady despite the hammer beating in my throat. I haven't set foot in Elias & Sons in 3 years. I have my own workshop now. If Marcus told you I touched that clock, he lied to you. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of a clock in her background. Not the broken one, but another one. A healthy one. He showed me a logbook, she said quietly. A leather-bound notebook with schedules and initials. It had your initials next to the intake date for my piece. My grandfather's ledger. ledger, the one Marcus had taken. He was using grandfather's old records from decades ago, or forging entries in the blank pages at the back, to create a paper trail that insulated him from his own incompetence. I have my own records, Mrs. Vanderhoof, I said, and I have 20 witnesses who can place me at my own benches every day for the last 5 months. If you want to see what my work actually looked like, you're welcome to come to the mill. I might just do that, she said, and the line went dead. I sat down on my stool, my legs suddenly feeling like wet cardboard. Lucas was sitting on his moving blanket, drawing a picture of a steam engine with a charcoal stick. He looked up at me. Are we in trouble, Mom? No, I said, though I couldn't look him in the eye. We're not in trouble, we're just working. 2 days passed without a word from anyone. The silence was louder than the argument. I worked like a woman possessed, finishing the Sheraton sideboard 2 days ahead of schedule. When the owner came to collect it, she spent 15 minutes just tracing the grain with her index finger, her eyes bright with satisfaction. She paid me in cash, $500 bills, which I immediately put into the steel lockbox under my floorboard. It was the largest single payment I'd received since opening the space, but the satisfaction didn't stick. Every time I looked at the door, I expected Marcus, or a lawyer, or Aunt Jane. It happened on Friday afternoon. The sky outside was the color of a wet slate shingle, and a cold drizzle was starting to slick the cobblestones of Crane Street. The iron door opened, but it wasn't Marcus. It was Aunt Jane. She looked smaller than she had 2 days ago. Her hair was damp from the rain, and she was wearing an old canvas coat that used to belong to my uncle. She didn't look angry anymore. She just looked tired. Clara, she said, staying near the threshold. Jane, I said. I didn't call her aunt. That privilege had ended when she helped Marcus change the padlocks on the workshop gate. Can I sit down? I pointed to the low three-legged stool near the lathe. She walked over, her joints stiff, and sat. She looked at the pieces around the room. The washstand, the small wall-set sewing table I'd just finished, the rows of specialized chisels hanging on the magnetic strip. Elias would be proud of this room, she said softly. Don't do that, I said, my voice hard. Don't bring grandfather into this now. She winced, her eyes dropping to her lap. Marcus is in over his head, Clara. He took a loan from a private lender 6 months ago to buy that Italian veneering machine and the imported lacquer inventory. He thought he could automate the prep work and double the output. He thought nobody would notice the difference if the gloss was high enough. The machine ruins the cell structure of the wood, I said. It heats the grain too fast. I told him that 4 years ago. He didn't listen, Jane sighed. He never listens. The lender, it's not a bank, Clara. It's a boutique investment group out of Boston. They specialize in distressed heritage brands. They didn't just give him cash. They took a lien on the property, the workshop, the land, everything. I felt a cold prickle of fear at the base of my neck. Grandfather owned that outright for 50 years, or Marcus signed it over as collateral, she whispered. He told me it was just a formality. He said the Vanderhoof contract would cover the first 3 installments, but now Mrs. Vanderhoof has frozen her account with us. She's demanding her deposit back, plus the value of the clock. And the Boston people sent a surveyor to the shop this morning. She looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed and watery. They're going to foreclose on the workshop, Clara. By the end of next month, the sign comes down. Elias and Sons is going to be cleared out and turned into a microbrewery or condo. Marcus is already talking about filing for personal bankruptcy to save his car. And your house? I asked. She didn't answer. She just bit her lip, her chin trembling, and looked away. That was answer enough. What do you want me to do, Jane? I asked, my voice dropping an octave. I have $500 in my lockbox and a rented room in an old mill. I can't buy out a Boston investment firm. I can't fix Marcus's debt. He has grandfather's secret book, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. The small one, not the logbook with the client names. The one with the stamps from the London Guild. The one from 1952. I froze. The journal from his apprenticeship? Yes, she said. The Boston people found out about it through the inventory Marcus submitted. They have a collector in Tokyo who offered $35,000 just for the notebook. They told Marcus if he hands over the book and the European oak table by Tuesday, they'll extend the loan deadline by 90 days. It would give us time to find another buyer for the business. No, I said, the word coming out before she could even finish. No, that book belongs to the family. It's the only thing left that has his actual handwritten chemical breakdowns for the historic stains. If that goes to a private collection in Japan, it's gone forever. It's just paper, Clara, Jane pleaded, reaching out to touch my arm. I pulled back before she could make contact. It's paper or my home. It's paper or the shop where you grew up. Marcus already gave up the shop when he signed that lien, I said. He gave it up the day he brought that lawyer to the hospice. Why should I give up grandfather's legacy to buy him 3 more months of driving a Porsche? Jane stood up, her face turning from desperate to bitter in a second. Because you're an Elias too, she said, her voice rising. You sit here in the mud playing the martyr, but you're just as selfish as he is. You'd rather see the whole thing burn than help us. I am helping the craft, I said, pointing to the door. Get out, Jane. She left, leaving a trail of wet footprints on the sawdust floor. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the rain rattle against our small apartment window. Lucas breathing softly in the twin bed across the room. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw grandfather's hands, thick scarred, with the dark permanent stain of walnut juice under the skin, holding that tiny London Guild notebook. He used to tell me that the formulas in that book weren't ours to sell. They were ours to keep the wood alive. At 6 a.m., I was back at the mill. I didn't turn on the lathe. I just sat at the bench with a cup of black coffee, watching the gray dawn slowly fill the room. Around 8 a.m., a car pulled up outside. It wasn't Marcus's sports car. It was a long black town car with silver trim. The driver got out, opened the back door, and an elderly woman stepped onto the gravel. She wore a heavy wool coat, a silk scarf tied under her chin, and carried a gold-headed walking stick. Eleanor Vanderhoof. She walked into the mill with the slow slow, deliberate pace of someone who owned every room she ever entered. She didn't look at the dust or the exposed pipe. She walked straight to my assembly table, where the Sheraton sideboard stood, ready for delivery. She stopped. She adjusted her glasses, leaning down until her nose was 6 inches from the wood. She didn't touch it. She just looked at the way the light reflected off the surface, not like a sheet of plastic, but like water over dark stone. My father had a chest by the same maker, she said, her voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. He used to say you could tell a real French polish by the way it held the shadows. Your brother told me this technique was dead. It's not dead, I said, rising from my stool. It just takes time. She stood up straight, looking at me with cold, pale eyes. Your brother is a small man, Clara. He came to my house yesterday afternoon. He brought the European oak table. He offered it to me as a settlement for the damage to the clock. I held my breath. Did you take it? I told him to leave it on my porch, she said. And then I called an independent appraiser from Boston. Do you know what he told me? He told you the table was authentic, I said. He told me the table was authentic, yes, she said, her lip curling slightly. But he also told me that someone artisan recently planed down the underside of the main bearer to remove a signature block. Someone wanted to make sure there was no record of who actually performed the structural stabilization 10 years ago. Marcus. He'd tried to erase grandfather's signature from the table, so the appraiser couldn't prove it was part of the original shop inventory that belonged to the estate, rather than his personal property. The clock is still in my car, Mrs. Vanderhoof said, turning toward the door. My driver will bring it in. I want you to look at it. Not for Marcus. For me. I can't work on it if it's part of a legal dispute, I said. My brother's firm has a lien on it, and if I touch it, there is no legal dispute regarding the clock anymore, she interrupted. I bought the debt from the Boston Investment Group this morning, Clara. I own the lien on Elias & Sons now. The coffee cup in my hand shook slightly. I set it down on the bench before I spilled it. You bought the loan? I don't like being lied to, she said simply. And I don't like seeing good wood ruined by people who think a business is just a spreadsheet. I own the mortgage on the workshop across the street. I own the equipment, and I own your brother's future. Now, I am asking you as a client if you can fix my clock. I looked out the window, across the wet asphalt of the avenue, toward the familiar bay windows of the old shop. I could see Marcus's sports car parked in its usual spot, but the lights inside the studio were off. For the first time in 50 years, the chimneys weren't smoking. I can fix it, I said, but it will take 3 months, and I work here, not there. Mrs. Vanderhoof looked around the drafty mill space, her eyes lingering on Lucas's drawing of the steam engine pinned to the wall. We'll see about that, she said. She turned to the door and gave a sharp nod. Her driver, a man built like a commercial refrigerator in a tailored suit, stepped out into the rain and opened the trunk of the town car. He didn't carry the clock case in a careless heap like Marcus had. He brought it in piece by piece, laying each section onto the clean, moving blankets I'd set up on the floor. Mrs. Vanderhoof didn't say a word while he worked. She just stood near the lathe, her hands resting on the gold head of her cane, watching me watch the wood. When the base of the clock was finally under the harsh white glow of my work light, I felt my stomach physically twist. It was worse than I'd realized when Marcus had dumped it on my bench. It wasn't just a bad dripping job. Marcus's guy had taken a mechanical sander to the crotch mahogany veneer. You could see the aggressive circular gouges cut deep into the grain. Crotch mahogany isn't just rare. It's basically a fragile layer of crystallized tree sap and twisted fiber. You look at it wrong and it cracked. Taking a power sander to it was like cleaning a Rembrandt with a wire brush. He panicked, I said, running my bare fingertips over the ruined finish. The chemical stripper didn't work fast enough, so he tried to grind off the remaining century-old varnish. He burned right through the veneer on the left flank. Can it be salvaged? Mrs. Vanderhoof asked. Her voice didn't. Yes. Repaired? Not easily. I'll have to source period-accurate Cuban mahogany, resaw it by hand, and splice it into the burned section so the grain matches exactly. Then I have to re-glue the structural splits using hot animal hide glue, clamp it for a week, and build up the finish using shellac and pumice powder, one microscopic layer at a time. I stood up and wiped my hands on my apron. It won't be cheap, and it won't be fast. I have plenty of time, and I have plenty of money, Clara, she said. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a standard heavy stock business envelope. She placed it on the edge of my workbench. That is the down payment for your time. The shop across the street is currently locked. The bank changed the cylinders at 9 o'clock this morning. Your brother is no longer permitted on the premises. I stared at the envelope. You locked him out? I protect my investments, she said simply. The building holds value. The equipment holds value. Your brother does not. I intend to liquidate the modern machinery he purchased, sell off the remaining inventory, and lease the building to a commercial tenant. Unless, of course, you want it. The air in the mill suddenly felt very thin. I looked out the window again. The old shop. The place where I'd learned how to mix stains. Where I'd sat on grandfather's knee while he explained the difference between a dovetail and a box joint. It was right there. All I had to do was say yes. No, I said. Mrs. Vanderhoof raised an eyebrow. Just a fraction of an inch, but on her face it was practically aghast. No, it's not Elias & Sons anymore, I told her, my voice remarkably steady. Marcus poisoned it. He ripped out the original ventilation. He painted over the exposed brick. He fired the 2 older craftsmen who worked with grandfather for 20 years. It smells like synthetic polymers and cheap shortcuts in there. It's not my home anymore, this is. I gestured to the drafty, rusted, beautiful mill. I build my own name here. Clara Harrison Restoration. Mrs. Vanderhoof studied me for a long time. Then the corner of her mouth twitched upward. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. Your grandfather was just as stubborn. He once refused to take a commission from the governor because the man insisted on using polyurethane on an antique dining table. Very well, Clara. You work here, but I expect weekly progress reports. She turned and walked out, her driver trailing behind her. When they they were gone, I opened the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $15,000, a down payment. I didn't celebrate. I didn't cheer. I just walked over to my hot plate, checked the consistency of my glue, and went to work. The weekend passed in a blur of intense solitary labor. I had to create a custom clamping jig just to hold the shattered base of the clock together while the hide glue cured. Lucas sat in the corner, building a massive fortress out of scrap pine blocks and listening to audiobooks. It was peaceful. It was the first time in 3 years I felt like I was actually breathing. But peace never lasts when Marcus is involved. Monday morning, 10 a.m. I was carefully matching the grain on a small patch of replacement veneer when the heavy iron door of the mill groaned open. I expected the mail carrier. I didn't expect a man in a beige city uniform holding a clipboard flanked by 2 police officers. I set my scalpel down carefully. My heart gave a heavy, stupid thud against my rib. "Can I help you?" The man with the clipboard stepped forward. He had the bored, exhausted look of a municipal bureaucrat who had already dealt with 10 screaming people before his first coffee break. "Clara Harrison?" he asked. "Yes, I'm Inspector Davies with the Department of Building Inspection. We received a formal complaint regarding this premises." He looked around, his eyes sweeping over the drying racks, the hot plate, the cans of denatured alcohol, and the massive exhaust fan I'd installed in the window. "A complaint?" I asked, wiping my hands on a rag. "From who?" "Complaints are anonymous," he said in a flat monotone. "But the allegation is that you are operating an unpermitted, high-risk commercial refinishing facility in an area zoned strictly for light industrial storage. Furthermore, the complaint alleges the storage of hazardous, highly flammable chemicals without proper fire suppression systems." He gestured toward my hot plate where the hide glue was warming. "Is that an open heat source near volatile solvents?" "It's a water bath," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "It never exceeds 140 degrees. The solvents are in a rated fireproof cabinet over there." Davies walked over to the cabinet. He checked the seal, made a note on his clipboard. Then he walked over to the exhaust fan. "Where is the permit for this ventilation system?" he asked. "The building owner, Mr. Harlan, installed it," I said. "He told me it was up to code, Mr. Harlan's permit for this building expired in 2018, Davies said, not looking up from his paperwork. "This building is condemned for commercial occupancy. You shouldn't even have the power turned on." My throat closed up. The police officer stood by the door, completely relaxed, just there to ensure compliance. They weren't looking at me like a criminal. They were looking at me like a nuisance. That somehow made it worse. "I just started this business," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "I'm restoring antique furniture. I'm not running a chemical plant. I have a major contract I have to finish." "I'm sorry, ma'am," Davies said, "but without the proper zoning variances, commercial occupancy permit, and a certified fire suppression system, this space is a hazard. I have to issue a stop work order, effective immediately." He tore a yellow sheet of paper off his clipboard and handed it to me. It felt heavy in my hand. "You have 48 hours to vacate the premises," he said. "If you are found working in here after Wednesday morning, the city will confiscate your equipment and you will face severe financial penalties. We'll be locking the main breaker box on our way out." "You can't cut the power," I said, stepping forward. "My glue has to stay warm. The temperature in the room needs to be stable for the veneer to set." "The power gets cut," one of the officers said, speaking for the first time. His tone wasn't mean, just final. "It's policy for an active fire hazard complaint. Gather your things, ma'am." They walked out. 2 minutes later, the overhead lights lammed off. The low hum of the exhaust fan died. The only light left in the room came through the dirty windows, casting long gray shadows across Mrs. Vanderhoof's clock. I stood in the silence for a long time. Then my phone buzzed in my apron pocket. It was a text message, not from an unknown number. From Marcus. Should have taken the 30%. Checkmate. I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles popped. He didn't just want me to fail. He wanted to break me. He had lost his shop, his reputation, his future. And his first instinct, his only instinct, was to drag me down into the dirt with him. I looked over at Lucas's pile of moving blankets. He was at school right now. He was going to come back here at 3:15, expecting to draw his trains while I worked. Instead, he was going to find his mother packing her tools into cardboard boxes in the dark. I put the phone away. I walked over to the electrical panel near the door. There was a thick yellow zip tie with a city seal on it locking the box shut. I walked back to my bench. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out heavy-duty bolt cutters. I didn't care about the fine. I didn't care about the city. Mrs. Vanderhoof had paid me $15,000 to fix her family's legacy, and I was going to fix it. If Marcus thought a yellow piece of paper was going to stop me after everything he'd done, he had profoundly underestimated how much I had left to lose. I walked up to the breaker box and snapped the city's lock in half. The thick yellow plastic gave way with a sharp crack that echoed against the brick walls. I pulled the severed pieces out of the hasp, let them drop to the sawdust-covered floor, and yanked the metal door open. The main breaker was a heavy black switch sitting in the off position. I didn't hesitate. I pushed it up. The overhead light flickered, buzzed, and flooded the room with harsh white light. The heavy exhaust fan in the window groaned, its blades catching up to speed until the familiar rhythmic thrum filled the space. Across the room, the red indicator light on my hot plate clicked back on. The hide glue hadn't lost too much heat yet. I walked back to the bench, picked up my scalpel, and bent over the clock base. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was adrenaline. Pure, spiteful adrenaline. I worked straight through the afternoon. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't check my phone. I carefully shaved down the edges of the ruined crotch mahogany, creating a clean, slightly beveled edge where the new wood would sit. It had to be perfect. If there was even a millimeter of gap, the hide glue would pool, dry dark, and leave a visible seam. For an hour, the only sounds were the scrape of high-carbon steel against 100-year-old wood and the steady drone of the fan pulling the dust out into the alley. At 3 o'clock, o'clock, the door opened. It was Lucas. He had his backpack over one shoulder, his jacket zipped up against the lingering rain. He took one look at the severed yellow zip tie on the floor, then at the heavy padlock the city inspector had left sitting on the fuse box, and then at me. 9-year-olds notice everything. Is that from the city? He asked, dropping his bag by his blanket fort. Yeah, I said, not looking up from the veneer. They came by to do a check. Are we getting kicked out? I stopped slicing. I looked at him. I wanted to tell him everything was fine, that it was just a misunderstanding, the kind of lie adults tell kids to keep them from worrying. But Lucas had spent the last 3 years watching me work retail for minimum wage while his uncle drove a Porsche. He knew what losing looked like. I don't know, Bug, I said honestly. The city says we don't have the right permit. We have until tomorrow to figure it out. But right now, this clock needs clamping, and if the glue gets cold, we have to start all over. He didn't ask any more questions. He just nodded, took his jacket off, and walked over to the clamp rack. Do you need the 4-inch or the cinch? We worked together in silence. By 6 o'clock, the fractured base was clamped tight in the custom jig I'd built. The hot hide glue was seeping slightly from the joints, a good sign, meaning the coverage was solid. I wiped away the excess with a hot, damp rag. Now, it just needed to cure. Usually, I'd leave it for a week. I had 12 hours before the inspector might come back with the police. I ordered a pizza for dinner. We ate it sitting on the floor near the radiator. I kept checking my phone. No new messages from Marcus. No calls from Jane. The silence was unnerving. Marcus wasn't the type to just send a text and walk away. If he knew he had successfully weaponized the city inspectors against me, he should have been gloating. At 8:30, my phone finally rang. It wasn't Marcus. The caller ID said Harlan Properties. I swallowed hard, wiped the grease off my fingers, and answered. Hello, Miss Harlan. Clara, he said. His voice sounded tight, older than it usually did. I just got off the phone with the Department of Building Inspection. They sent a certified notice to my attorney. I can explain. I started, standing up. It was Marcus. He called them in. I just need. Doesn't matter who called them in, Clara, Harlan interrupted gently. The inspector flagged the building for unpermitted commercial use, hazardous material storage, and a code violation electrical load. They didn't just red tag your unit. They flagged the whole mill. The city is threatening to pull my insurance if the property isn't vacated and secured by tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning? The inspector told me 48 hours. He said Wednesday. The inspector didn't know you broke the municipal seal on the breaker box, Harlan said softly. My blood ran cold. How do they know that? Because your brother called the city compliance hotline an hour ago and reported you for tampering with a municipal lock. They sent a cruiser by the alley. The cops saw your lights on and your exhaust fan running. They called the inspector who called me. Harlan sighed, a long, ragged sound. Clara, I want to help you. I gave you the space because I know what your grandfather meant to this town, but I can't lose this property. If you're still in there tomorrow at 8 a.m., the city is bringing a locksmith and the police to confiscate everything inside as evidence of code violation, including your tools, including the Vanderhoof clock. I looked at the clock. The glue wall was still. If I moved it now, the sheer stress of being loaded into a truck would pop the joint. The repair would be ruined, and the original wood would splinter beyond saving. Mr. Harlan, I have a piece in clamps right now. The glue is wet. If I move it, it shatters. I'm sorry, Clara, I really am. But you have to be out by dawn. Keep the key. Leave it under the mat. He hung up. I slowly lowered the phone. The room felt massive and empty, despite the clutter of wood and tools. Tomorrow at 8 a.m., 12 hours. Mom? Lucas was looking at me, a half-eaten slice of pizza in his hand. What did Mr. Harlan say? He said we have to pack, I said, my voice hollow. I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything. I just went to the corner, pulled out a stack of flattened cardboard moving boxes, and started taping them together. I wrapped my chisels in oiled leather rolls. I packed the glass bottles of shellac flakes, the pumice stone, the rotten stone, the beeswax. I packed the hand planes grandfather had given me for my 18th birthday. By 11 p.m., the shop was mostly in boxes. Lucas had fallen asleep on his pile of blankets, curled up in his jacket. The only things left out were the assembly bench, the clamp holding the clock, and the heat lamps I'd set up to try and force cure the glue. Hide glue doesn't work like modern chemical adhesive. You can't just bake it to make it dry faster. It needs to crystallize. Heat helps evaporate the moisture, but too much heat makes it brittle. It was a delicate, agonizing balance. I sat on my stool, watching the joint, occasionally adjusting the lamps by a few inches. Just past midnight, I heard a car pull slowly onto the cobblestones of Crane Street. The headlights swept across the frosted glass of the mill windows. I tensed, reaching instinctively for a heavy wooden mallet on the bench. If it was the police early, I had no plan. If it was Marcus, I was going to use the mallet. The car engine cut off. A car door opened and closed. Heavy footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. I walked to the door and looked through the small, dirty peephole. It wasn't a cop. It wasn't Marcus. It was Thomas. Thomas was a master cabinet maker who had worked alongside my grandfather for 30 years. He was the one who had taught me how to sharpen a scraper, so fine it could take a shaving off a piece of maple thin enough to read through. Marcus had fired him 2 months after grandfather died, claiming Thomas was too slow and his methods were obsolete. I unbolted the door and pulled it open. Thomas stood there in a heavy wool coat, a thermos in one hand, and a wooden toolbox in the other. He looked exactly the same as he had 3 years ago. Thick silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and hands that looked like they were carved out of old oak. Heard you were having a bit of trouble with the city, Thomas said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble. How did you know? I asked, stepping back to let him in. Bobby from the hardware store called me, Thomas said, stepping into the drafty room. He looked at the boxes, the empty shelves, and finally, the clock sitting under the heat lamp. He walked over to it, set his thermos down, and put his face close to the clamped-it joint. He didn't say a word for a full minute. He just inspected the gap, the squeeze out, the alignment of of the grain. Good tension, he finally said. You matched the crotch figure perfectly. Elias would be happy with this. It doesn't matter, I said, crossing my arms to keep them from shaking. The city is coming at 8 to seize the building. If I move the clock, the glue fails. If I leave it, they take it. And Mrs. Vanderhoof owns the lien on Marcus's shop now. She's giving me a chance to take it back, but if I ruins this piece, you won't ruin it, Thomas said. He opened his toolbox. Inside were rows of custom braces, specialized clamping cauls, and a heavy iron pot. Hide glue needs time, or it needs a chemical catalyst to speed the crystallization without losing structural integrity. Elias used to use a mix of urea and a touch of alum when we had to do emergency field repairs on museum pieces. I stared at him. The formula from the London Guild book. Thomas gave a short, dry chuckle. Elias didn't just write it down. He made me mix it for 20 years. I don't need the book. He pulled a small glass jar filled with a white powder from his box. We can inject this into the exposed glue line. It will chemically flash cure the outer layer, creating a rigid shell. It'll hold the joint together long enough to survive a truck ride across town. The inside will cure naturally over the next week. Across town to where? I asked. I don't have another workspace. Thomas looked up at me over his glasses. Mrs. Vanderhoof bought the debt, Clara. She owns the building across the street. The bank changed the locks, yes, but who do you think installed those old mortise locks in the front doors 40 years ago? He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a heavy brass skeleton key. It was worn smooth from use. Marcus changed the deadbolts on the delivery gate, Thomas said quietly, but he never changed the locks on the main showroom doors. He didn't know how to remove the heritage brass plates without scratching them, so he just left them. This is my old key. I looked at the key, then at Thomas. If we move it into the old shop, we're trespassing. Mrs. Vanderhoof gave you the contract, Thomas countered. She gave you the down payment. She legally owns the property right now. You aren't trespassing if the owner hired you to do the work. He paused, his expression hardening. And besides, it's your shop. It always was. I looked over at Lucas, still sleeping soundly under his jacket. Then I looked at the clock. Okay, let's flash cure it. For the next 3 hours, Thomas and I worked side by side. It was like no time had passed at all. We didn't need to speak much. When he needed a syringe, I handed it to him. When I needed him to adjust the clamping pressure while I applied the alum mixture, he was already doing it. The smell of the urea mixing with the hide glue was sharp and astringent, cutting through the damp mill air. By 4 a.m., the outer layer of glue had turned into a hard amber-like resin. It wasn't pretty, but it was solid. It'll hold, Thomas said, tapping the joint lightly with the handle of a screwdriver. It made a sharp, rigid sound, but we have to move it carefully, very carefully. I woke Lucas up. He rubbed his eyes, confused by the time and the presence of Thomas, but he didn't complain. He just put his backpack on and held the door open as Thomas and I carefully lifted the base of the clock. We didn't use a hand truck. The vibrations over the cobblestones would be too risky. We carried it by hand. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets lick and black under the orange glow of the streetlight. We walked slowly, our breath pluming in the cold air, carrying the heavy mahogany base out of the mill, down the alley, and across the empty avenue. The old shop loomed in front of us. Elias and Sons. The painted letters on the brick were starting to fade. The big bay windows were dark. Thomas set his end down gently on the sidewalk, took the brass key, and slid it into the heavy front door. It turned with a heavy, satisfying click. He pushed the door open. The smell hit me instantly. Beneath the harsh chemical tang of Marcus's cheap synthetic lacquers, the old smell was still there. Beeswax, linseed oil, sawdust, home. We carried the clock inside and set it down on the main assembly table, grandfather's table. I went back to the mill twice more with Thomas's truck, loading my boxes, my tools, my hot plate. We left the mill completely empty, swept clean, with the key sitting neatly under the front mat just as Mr. Harlan had asked. We were out by 6 a.m. I was standing in the old shop, unpacking my chills when my phone rang. It was 7:30 a.m. I answered it. Hello, Clara. It was Jane. She was crying, not the angry, manipulative tears from before. Real, ragged sobbing. Jane, what is it? It's Marcus, she choked out. He's gone. I stopped moving. What do you mean gone? I woke up this morning. His car isn't in the driveway. His closet is empty. He took his passport, Clara. She took a shuddering breath. He left a letter on the kitchen counter. The Boston investors didn't just take the shop. He borrowed against my house, Clara. He forged my signature on a second mortgage to pay for the materials he ruined. The bank is foreclosing on me on Monday. He knew. He knew and he ran. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the jagged, wet sound of my aunt breathing. The old grandfather clock in the corner of the showroom, the one Marcus hadn't managed to break yet, chimed the half hour. It sounded hollow in the dusty room. I looked over at Thomas. He had already opened his toolbox and was carefully wiping down a set of original Marples chisels that Marcus had left rusting on a damp windowsill. Thomas didn't ask who was on the phone. He already knew the shape of a disaster when he saw it. Clara? Jane's voice was barely a whisper now. Are you there? I'm here. I don't know what to do. The bank sent the notice yesterday, but I didn't open it because I thought it was just another late fee. Marcus told me he had a grace period. He told me the Boston people were giving him an extension. He lied to you, Jane. He's been lying to you since the day grandfather went into hospice. Where did he go? She sobbed. A pathetic, desperate sound that made my stomach twist. His car is still here. He took an Uber to the airport. I saw the receipt on his iPad, but it doesn't say where his flight is going. It doesn't matter where he went, I said. My voice was completely flat. I wasn't angry anymore. The anger had burned out hours ago, somewhere around the time I was snapping a municipal lock with bolt cutters. Now there was just this cold, heavy clarity. He's gone, and he's not coming back to save you. I'm gonna lose my home, Clara. I know. Can Mrs. Vanderhoof stop? I cut her off, my tone dropping like a stone. Do not even finish that sentence. Mrs. Vanderhoof is not a charity. She is a client who bought a commercial lien because she hates incompetence. She owes you nothing. nothing. I owe you nothing. Silence on the line save for a sharp intake of breath. But you are my family, Jane whispered. You forgot that 3 years ago, I replied. When you watched him change the locks on me. When you let him tell me I was nothing but a hobbyist. Pack a bag, Jane. Bring your important papers. Come down to the shop. Don't go to the bank. Don't call a lawyer yet. Just get here. I hung up before she could say anything else. I set my phone down on the assembly table, right next to the clamped, flash-cured base of the Vanderhoof clock. The amber resin holding the joints together looked ugly, but it was solid. Thomas was right. It would hold until the inner hide glue crystallized. Marcus? Thomas asked, not looking up from his chisels. Gone, I said. Took his passport. Left Jane with a forged second mortgage and a foreclosure notice for Monday. Thomas stopped wiping the metal. He looked out the bay window at the gray morning light filtering onto the avenue. He shook his head slowly. Elias knew, you know. Before the end. He knew the boy had no respect for the wood. He told me once that Marcus looked at a tree and only saw a dollar sign. A man like that can't build anything. Can only strip it down and sell the part. He sold everything, I said, looking around the shop. Now that the adrenaline of the move was fading, I was really seeing the face for the first time in 3 years. In the dark, it had smelled like home. But in the morning light, the reality of Marcus's tenure was glaring. He had ripped out the old drying racks in the back to install a massive metal spray booth. The walls of the booth were coated in thick, sticky layers of catalyzed polyurethane, a plastic finish that cured in 10 minutes and looked like it belonged on a cheap bowling alley floor, not a piece of heritage furniture. There were empty 5-gallon buckets of chemical thinners stacked haphazardly in the corner. The floor, which used to be swept clean every night so you could eat off it, was caked with a permanent, toxic sludge of spilled resin and sawdust. Worst of all was the silence. The old mechanical rhythms of the shop were dead. The belt-driven lathe grandfather had restored in the 80s was gone, likely sold for scrap or to a pawn shop to cover a monthly loan payment. In its place was a sleek digital CNC router, a computer-controlled machine meant to mass-produce cheap decorative moldings. It sat there like a foreign invader, entirely out of place in a room built for hands and sweat. Lucas came walking out from the small office in the back. He had found grandfather's old leather armchair, the one Marcus apparently hadn't bothered to throw away, and had slept the last hour in it. He looked around the vast, cluttered room. Is this great-grandpa's shop? He asked, rubbing his eyes. Yeah, Bug, this is it. It smells funny, he said, wrinkling his nose, like the nail polish aisle at the pharmacy. That's the lacquer, Thomas grunted. He picked up an empty bucket of thinner and tossed it heavily into a metal trash can. It made a loud, hollow bang, and we're getting rid of it. I walked over to the office. The door was ajar. I pushed it open. Marx hadn't just led. He had panicked. The filing cabinets were pulled open, paper scattered across the floor. He had clearly been looking for cash or documents or both. The ledger books from the last 3 years were stacked on the desk, haphazard and incomplete. I walked behind the desk and looked at the wall. There used to be a framed black and white photograph of grandfather and Thomas standing in front of the shop in 1978, holding a freshly restored Victorian chaise. Marcus had taken it down. In its place was a whiteboard covered in dry erase marker. It was a list of clients' dates and dollar amounts. Half of them were crossed out in angry, jagged red lines. Next to Mrs. Vanderhoof's name, Marcus had written, deposit bent stall until 15th. He hadn't just ruined the wood. He had run a Ponzi scheme with antique restorations, using deposits from new clients to pay for the materials and bits of the old ones. Clara, Thomas's voice called out from the main floor. I walked back out. Through the bay windows, I could see a sleek black town car pull up to the curb. It parked smoothly right in front of the loading zone. The driver got out, opened an umbrella against the light morning drizzle, and opened the back door. Mrs. Vanderhoof stepped out. She was wearing a different coat today, a sharp charcoal wool trench, but she had the same gold-headed walking stick. She looked at the front door of the shop, then up at the faded sign. She didn't look surprised to see the lights on. I walked over and unlocked the front door just as she reached for the handle. She stepped inside, her driver waiting by the car. She took a deep breath, her nose wrinkling exactly the way Lucas's had. She tapped her cane against the hardwood floor, surveying the spray booth, the CNC machine, the chemical bucket, and finally Thomas standing near the workbench. Thomas gave her a slight nod. Ma'am, Mr. Sterling, she replied smoothly. I haven't seen you since you repaired the hinges on my father's campaign desk 8 years ago. Your work has held up beautifully. Hide glue and brass screws, ma'am, Thomas said. They don't fail. Mrs. Vanderhoof turned her sharp, pale eyes to me. I sent a property manager here at 7:30 this morning to do a preliminary assessment of the locks. He called me in a panic, stating that the heritage brass plates on the front doors had been bypassed. The lights were on, and there was a woman inside drinking coffee next to my family's clock. I can explain, I started, wiping my hands on my apron. The city inspector red-tagged the mill on Crane Street, she said, cutting me off. Code violation. Hazardous storage. I read the municipal report online 20 minutes ago. A complaint was filed at roughly 8 o'clock last night by a concerned citizen who sounded remarkably like your brother. I blinked. You read the municipal report? I own 3 commercial blocks in this district, Clara. When a building inspector red tags a property within my zip code, my office is notified. I assumed you would call me when you were evicted. I did not assume you would break into a foreclosed property in the middle of the night and relocate an active restoration project. She walked slowly over to the assembly table. She looked closely at the base of the clock. She saw the heavy clamp, the custom calls, and the hard, amber-crusted lines of the flash-cured urea mixture. She leaned in close, inspecting the grain match on the crotch mahogany. It's a chemical flash cure, I explained quickly, stepping up beside her. Thomas and I used it to create a rigid outer shell so the joint wouldn't pop during transport. The inner hide glue is still crystallizing naturally. It won't affect the final finish. I'll send sand away the urea cap once the core is stable. Mrs. Vanderhoof didn't say anything for a long time. She just traced the air above the repair with her index finger, never actually touching the wood. You move this by hand? She asked. Yes, we carried it across street. The truck vibrations would have ruined the tension. She straightened up, leaning her weight lightly on the cane. Your brother called me at midnight from the airport. My chest tightened. What did he want? He wanted to sell me the London Guild notebook, the one containing your grandfather's formulas. He said he needed $35,000 wired immediately to an offshore account, or he was going to sell it to a buyer in Tokyo who had already made an offer. I felt the blood drain from my face. Did you buy it? I told him I do not negotiate with desperate men who use heritage as a hostage, she said coldly. And I told him that if he ever contacted me again, I would have my attorneys forward his forged inventory documents to the district attorney for felony fraud. He's gone, I said, my voice hollow. He left Jane with a second mortgage he forged in her name. She loses her house on Monday. Mrs. Vanderhoof looked at me, her expression unreadable. She glanced at Thomas, who was quietly packing Marcus's trash bag full of synthetic sanding pads, and then at Lucas, who was sitting on the old armchair reading a comic book. The machinery, she said, gesturing toward the spray booth and the CNC router with her cane. How much is it worth? The spray booth is top of the line, I said, trying to follow her logic. Maybe 40,000 installed. The CNC router is another 30. He bought them all on credit, but I own the lien, she noted, which means I own the fixtures left on the property. Yes! She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a sleek black smartphone. She dialed a number, holding the phone to her ear. She didn't break eye contact with me. Arthur, she said into the phone. The industrial equipment in the Elias & Sons building. I want it liquidated. Today. Call the commercial liquidators in the industrial park. Tell them they have until 6 o'clock tonight to dismantle the spray booth and remove the router. If they can do it today, they can have it for 40 cents on the dollar. She paused, listening. I don't care about the margins, Arthur. I want the floor space cleared. Yes, put the proceeds into an escrow account. She hung up and slipped the phone back into her pocket. She looked at me. The proceeds from the equipment sale will cover the initial debt on your aunt's home. Barely. But it will stop Monday's foreclosure. I stared at her, completely stunned. Why would you do that? You said yourself you aren't a charity. I am not, she said sharply. I am a patron of the old ways. And this shop cannot function as it is meant to if its master craftsman is distracted by the financial ruin of her family. You cannot work wood if your hands are shaking from guilt. She pointed her cane at the floor. This is your shop now, Clara. Not as a tenant, as an operator. I hold the mortgage. You run the business. You take 60% of the profit. I take 40 until the principal is paid off. And you will rebuild this place exactly as Elias left it. No synthetic. No shortcut. Before I could even process the magnitude of what she was saying, the front door of the shop opened with a harsh, desperate shove. It was Jane. She looked awful. Her hair was unbrushed. Her coat was thrown on unevenly over a faded sweater, and she was clutching a plastic grocery bag stuffed with manila folders. Her eyes were red and swollen, darting around the shop until they landed on me. She didn't even register Mrs. Vanderhoof or Thomas. Clara, Jane gasped, practically stumbling into the room. The bank called. The local branch manager. Marcus didn't just forge the mortgage. He emptied the business account. The payroll, the vendor lines, everything is gone. I'm overdrawn by $12,000 on my personal checking because he linked it as collateral last month, and I didn't read the paperwork. She dropped the grocery bag onto the floor. The folders spilled open, scattering bank statements and overdue notices across the dusty hardwood. I have nothing, Jane sobbed, dropping to her knees right there in the middle of the showroom. I have absolutely nothing. I stood there, looking down at the woman who had locked me out of my own life 3 years ago. The woman who had told me to stop playing the martyr, Mrs. Vanderhoof watched the scene with mild aristocratic detachment, her hands resting calmly on her cane. I walked slowly around the assembly table. I didn't reach down to help Jane up. I just looked at the scattered papers on the floor. The house is saved, Jane, I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried in the large room. Jane stopped crying for a second, looking up at me with wide, disbelieving eyes. What? Mrs. Vanderhoof is liquidating Marcus's modern equipment to cover the second mortgage. The foreclosure will be stopped. Jane let out a sound that was half gasp, half law, reaching a hand up toward me as if I was going to pull her into an embrace. Oh, Clara, thank God. Thank God, I knew you wouldn't let me. I'm not finished, I said, stepping back so her hand grabbed empty air. Jane froze. The house is saved, I repeated, but your personal debt is your own. The business accounts are empty. There is no Elias & Sons anymore. Marcus killed it. This is Clara Harrison Restoration now. But my checking account, Jane stammered, her hands hovering over the scattered papers. I can't buy groceries. I can't pay the electricity. I gave up my job to manage the office here. Clara, you have to hire me back, please. I know the client. I know the books. I looked at the whiteboard in the office with its red jagged lines and stolen deposits. I looked at Thomas, who was quietly watching me, waiting to see what kind of owner I was going to be. You don't know the books, Jane, I said. If you did, you would have seen Marcus stealing from people for 3 years. You didn't manage anything. You just answered the phone and cashed the checks while he destroyed our grandfather's legacy. Jane's face flushed a deep, mottled red. The desperation morphed back into the familiar, defensive bitterness she always wore when cornered. I did what I had to do. He was the owner. He was the man of the family after Elias died. What was I supposed to do? Challenge him? Yes, I said. That is exactly what you were supposed to do. Thomas challenged him, and Marcus fired him. I challenged him, and he banned me from the property. You stayed quiet, and now you have a grocery bag full of overdraft notices. I pointed to the front door. Pick up your papers, Jane. You can go home. Your house is safe. But you don't work here. You will never work here again. Jane stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently. She looked to Thomas for support, but the old cabinet maker simply turned his back and went to the sink. sink to wash his hands. She looked at Mrs. Vanderhoof, who merely arched a single perfectly groomed eyebrow. Slowly, Jane gathered her folders, her hands shaking so violently she dropped them twice. She shoved them back into the plastic bag, stood up, and walked to the door. She didn't look back as she pulled it open and stepped out into the rain. The heavy door clicked shut. The shop was quiet again. The good kind of quiet. Well, Mrs. Vanderhoof said, adjusting her silk scarf. That was unpleasant but necessary. Pruning always is. She turned to leave. The liquidators will be here by noon. I expect the spray booth gone by this evening. Send me an update on the clock by Friday, Clara. I will, I said. She walked out to her waiting car. The driver closed the door, and the black town car glided away down the wet avenue. I stood in the center of the showroom. I looked up at the high tin ceiling. I looked at the old brick walls hiding behind Marcus's cheap white paint. Thomas, I called out. He dried his hands on a rag and walked over. Yeah, boss? The word boss felt strange but right. How long to strip the paint off that brick? With chemical peel? 2 days. With heat guns and scrapers? A week. Get the heat guns, I said. We don't use chemicals here. Thomas smiled. A real deep smile that reached his eyes. I'll go get my heavy scrapers from the truck. He headed for the back door. I walked over to the office and grabbed an eraser. I stood in front of the whiteboard and wiped away Marcus's desperate fraudulent client list. I wiped until the board was completely white. Then I picked up a black marker. I didn't write a schedule. I didn't write a budget. I wrote Clara Harrison Restoration. Today. I was still looking at the board when I heard the front door chime ring. Not the heavy push of the door, but the small brass bell Marcus had installed above it. I walked out of the office. A man was standing in the foyer. He wasn't a liquidator. He wasn't a client. He was wearing a damp, cheap windbreaker, holding a flat, padded shipping envelope. He looked nervously around the massive shop, his eyes darting toward the heavy machinery. Can I help you? I asked, stepping forward. The man looked at me, then down at a piece of paper taped to the envelope. Are you Clara Harrison? I am. I was told to drop this off, he said. He didn't step any further into the room. He just placed the envelope on the edge of the nearest display table and backed away quickly. The guy paid me $50 cash at the bus station to walk it over here. Said it was urgent. Before I could ask him who the guy was, the man turned and practically bolted out the door. I walked over to the table. The envelope was wet from the rain. There was no return address, just my name written in jagged, hurried black ink. I knew that handwriting. It was Marcus's. I picked up the envelope. It felt heavy, solid. I grabbed my utility knife from my apron pocket and sliced the tape. I tipped the envelope up down. A small black leather book slid out and hit the table with a dull thud. The leather was cracked and worn at the edges. Embossed in the center, barely visible under decades of wood dust and hand oils, was a small, intricate stamp of a chisel crossing a wooden mallet, the crest of the London Guild. It was grandfather's notebook, the real one. I stared at it. My heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against my rib. Marcus had told Mrs. Vanderhoof he was going to sell it to Tukio. He had demanded $35,000 for it at midnight. But here it was, delivered by a stranger from the bus station at 9 in the morning. I reached out and opened the cover. The pages were brittle, filled with grandfather's precise cramped cursive, chemical breakdowns, radios for hide glue, temperature guides for curing specific varnishes, the soul of his craft meticulously documented over 50 years. But tucked inside the front cover was a folded piece of cheap motel stationery. I pulled it out and unfolded it. Clara, they didn't want the book. The Tokyo buyer was a lie I made up to stall the Boston guys, but they found out. They didn't just want the property, Clara. They wanted the brand. They wanted the Elias name to mass-produce heritage furniture for overseas shipping. I tried to back out when I realized, but they have my signature on the commercial liability clauses. If I default, they don't just take the shop. They take the intellectual property. All of it. I can't go to jail, Clara. I can't do it. Don't let them have the book. Keep it safe. Tell Jane I'm sorry. M. I read the letter twice. The words blurred together. I looked at the book. Mrs. Vanderhoof had bought the lien. She owned the debt. But Marcus hadn't known that when he ran. He thought the Boston Investment Group was still coming. He thought they were going to strip the Elias name and mass produce it. But wait. I stopped breathing for a second, my eyes tracing the lines of the letter again. They didn't just want the property. They wanted the brand. They wanted the Elias name. If Mrs. Vanderhoof bought the lien from the Boston Group, did she buy the commercial rights to the name too? Clara? I jumped. Lucas was standing beside me, looking at the small black book. Is that great-grandpa's notebook? Yes, Bug, I whispered, closing the cover quickly. It is. Why do you look scared? I looked at the front door. The rain was coming down harder now, washing over the bay windows, blurring the street outside. Mrs. Vanderhoof had been so quick to liquidate the machinery, so quick to give me the shop, so quick to establish her percentage of the profit. I am not a charity. I am a patron of the old ways. I grabbed my phone from my apron pocket and dialed Mr. Harlan. He picked up on the second ring. Clara? Are you out of the mill? The inspector is coming in an hour. I'm out, Mr. Harlan. We're clear. I need to ask you a question. You know the commercial real estate market here. You know the players. I know enough, he said cautiously. Why? The Boston Investment Group that held Marcus's loan. Who are they? They're a shell, Harlan said, the line crackling slightly. A holding company. They buy up distressed heritage properties across New England. Mills, old factories, legacy was workshop. They acquire the debt, foreclose, and then strip the brand rights to sell overseas. They call themselves Heritage Acquisitions, LLC. My mouth went completely dry. Who owns Heritage Acquisitions, Mr. Harlan? There was a long pause. I could hear Harlan typing on a keyboard in his office. Let's see. Public records show the primary managing partner is a trust, the Eleanor V. Trust. The phone slipped from my ear. I caught it before it hit the floor, but I couldn't speak. Mrs. Vanderhoof didn't buy the debt from the Boston Group this morning. She was the Boston Group. She was the one who gave Marcus the predatory loans 6 months ago. She was the one who funded his synthetic machinery, knowing he would fail. She engineered the entire collapse of Elias & Sons. She didn't come to save the shop. She came to own it, and now he owned me. I bent down and picked the phone off the floor. The screen was cracked, a spiderweb of glass branching across Miss Harlan's name. My hand was shaking so badly I almost dropped it a second time. I'm still here, I said, my voice sounding hollow, like it belonged to someone else. Clara, Harlan said, his tone thick with a heavy, tired pity. Be careful with these people. They don't care about wood. They care about portfolios. They buy up history, hollow it out, and sell the skin. I hung up. I looked at the small black book sitting the display table. Lucas was still watching me from the armchair. I forced my breathing to slow down. I grabbed the notebook, walked over to my rolling toolbox, and shoved it deep into the bottom compartment, wrapping it in an old oilcloth and burying it beneath a pile of heavy steel mallets and blunt rasps. Thomas walked back into the room holding a heat gun. He took one look at my face, saw the way I slammed the toolbox drawer shut, and stopped. What is it? Asked. She bought the debt 6 months ago, Thomas, I said, keeping my voice low so Lucas wouldn't hear the panic edging into it. Mrs. Vanderhoof. She funded Marcus's new equipment through a shell company called Heritage Acquisitions. She set the trap, waited for him to ruin himself, and then stepped in to claim the carcass. Thomas didn't look surprised. He just looked tired, the deep lines around his eyes sagging as he set the heat gun down on the assembly table. The rich don't leave things to chance, Clara. They buy the board before the game starts. What does she want? The brand, I said. Marcus wrote me a letter. He left the London Guild book here. He said they want the Elias name to mass-produce heritage furniture for overseas shipping. Thomas's jaw tightened. The thought of Elias and Son stamped on a factory-line MDF cabinet shipped out of a warehouse in Shenzhen was enough to make the old cabinet maker physically sick. He looked around the shop, at the tin ceilings and the dust motes, like he was suddenly seeing a graveyard. At noon, the liquidators arrived. It wasn't just a crew of guys in work boots with wrenches and dollies. They were accompanied by a man in a sharp, tailored gray suit holding a leather portfolio. Arthur, the man Mrs. Vanderhoof had called from the shop earlier. Arthur stood by the front door, watching the crew begin dismantling Marcus's massive spray booth. He didn't look at the wood in the showroom. He didn't look at the tools. He looked at the walls, the square footage, calculating the yield. Then he walked over to my bench. Harrison, he said, offering a smooth, practiced smile that didn't move any of the muscles in his upper face. Eleanor asked me to bring over the preliminary paperwork for your new operating agreement. Just some standard boilerplate to get the utilities transferred and establish the LLC structure. He set a thick stack of stapled paper on my workbench, right next to my chisel. She mentioned a 60-40 split, I said, not touching the paper. Yes, exactly. Very generous. Arthur nodded, unbuttoning his suit jacket. The trust will retain 60% of net profits until the principal debt is cleared, at which point it flips to 40% in perpetuity. In exchange, the trust assumes all liability for the property, the structure, and the brand management. Brand management, I repeated. We'll be handling the marketing, the licensing, and the trademark registrations, he said smoothly. Eleanor wants to elevate the Elias & Sons name, global reach, boutique hotels, luxury developments in Dubai and Tokyo. We have manufacturers lined up who can replicate the aesthetic of your grandfather's work at scale. You, of course, will remain the face of the brand here in the flagship studio, a working showroom. People love authenticity. I looked at Thomas. He was gripping a wooden hand plane so hard his knuckles were stark white. Replicate the aesthetic, I said. You mean mass-produce. We prefer the term scaled heritage, Arthur corrected without missing a beat. Now, to finalize the licensing, the contract stipulates that all proprietary techniques, historical records, and chemical formulas associated with Elias & Sons be digitized and transferred to the trust legal department. Eleanor mentioned there might be a specific notebook, a guild journal. The room went dead quiet. The sound of the liquidators tearing down metal panels in the back felt like it was happening underwater. He knew. She knew. They had Marcus pinned for the book, and when he bolted, they pivoted straight to me. Mrs. Vanderhoof hadn't given me the shop because she respected my work. She gave me the shop to keep me compliant while her lawyers stripped my family's history for part. I was just the mascot they needed to make the factory furniture look real. I haven't seen a notebook, I lied. My voice was incredibly steady. Arthur's smile finally slipped. Just a fraction. That's unfortunate. The transfer of the intellectual property is a hard condition of the operating agreement. Without it, the trust will have no choice but to liquidate the entire asset. The building, the inventory, everything. We'd have to evict you immediately. He stepped lightly closer, dropping his voice. And given the fact that the city red-tagged your previous location last night, I imagine the police would be very interested to know how a piece of property belonging to a foreclosed estate, namely Eleanor's grandfather clock, was illegally moved across the street in the dead of night. I stared at him. He was threatening me with a criminal trespassing and theft charge. Eleanor is a very reasonable woman, Clara, Arthur said, smoothing his tie, but she does not tolerate friction. Find the book. Sign the paper. You have a beautiful setup here. It would be a shame to lose it on your first day. He tapped the stack of papers, turned on his heel, and walked out of the shop. I stood frozen, staring at the thick stack of legal paper on my bench. The trap had snapped shut. Marcus had run away from it, but he had left me standing right on the pressure plate. Mom? I looked over. Lucas had put his comic book down. He was looking at the liquidators hauling pieces of the CNC router out the back door, and then at me. Are we getting kicked out again? No, I said fiercely. No, we're not. I grabbed the thick contract and flipped to the last page. Signature lines, notary seals. Pages and pages of legalese designed to take everything Elias had built and feed it into a corporate shredder. What are you going to do? Thomas asked quietly. They have the mortgage. They have the leverage. If you don't give them the formulas, they throw us out and call the cops on you for moving the clock. The clock, I muttered. I looked at the massive, shattered base of the Vanderhoof long case clock sitting in its custom clamping jig under the work light. The amber resin of the flash cure was holding the mortise together perfectly. She cares about that clock, I said. She told Marcus she bought the lien because she hated seeing good wood ruined, but that was a lie. She bought the lien for the brand. So, Thomas asked, so why did she bring the clock here? I walked over to the piece, running my hand lightly over the brass finial. If she just wanted the shop and the book, she didn't need to hire me to fix her family heirloom. She has unlimited money. She could have sent this clock to the best conservators in London or Paris, but she brought it to me. Why? Thomas frowned, stepping up beside me and looking down at the damaged mahogany. Because it's part of the narrative. The old world patron supporting the struggling local craftsman. It looks good on paper when they launched the brand. No, I said, a strange cold realization settling over me. It's because it's not her clock. Thomas looked at me like I was crazy. What? When she called me yesterday, I said, my mind racing backward, piecing the conversation together. She didn't say it was her clock. She said it was a clock that had been in her family for 4 generations. But Arthur just called it Eleanor's grandfather clock. And when she was in here earlier, she didn't touch it. She didn't look at it like it was a beloved heirloom. She looked at it like it was a piece of evidence. I walked over to the office. I started digging through the scattered folders Jane had dropped, the ones I had told her to take. She had left half of them in her panic. I found the original intake receipt Marcus had filed for the Vanderhoof account. I scanned the document, client name, the estate of Charles Vanderhoof. Charles, I said aloud. I pulled out my phone and did a quick search for Charles Vanderhoof. The obituary popped up immediately. Charles Vanderhoof, prominent industrialist, passed away 7 months ago, survived by his second wife, Eleanor, and a son from his first marriage, Richard. I scrolled down to the legal notices. There was a massive ongoing probate dispute in the state Supreme Court. Richard Vanderhoof was suing his stepmother, Eleanor, claiming she was mismanaging the estate and improperly liquidating heritage assets that were specifically willed to him. Assets like a documented museum-grade 1820 English long case clock. I lowered the phone. Thomas, I said, my voice tight. She didn't bring the clock here to be fixed because she loves it. She brought it here to hide it. Thomas walked over, wiping his hands on a rag. Hide it from who? From her stepson, I said. Marcus ruined it. If the stepson finds out Eleanor handed over a $40,000 piece of his inheritance to an incompetent hack who put a power sander to it, it proves his case in court. She's mismanaging the estate. She could lose control of the trust. The same trust that owns Heritage Acquisitions. The same trust that owns this building. I looked back out at the shop floor. The liquidators were packing up their trucks. Arthur was long gone. Eleanor Vanderhoof thought she had me trapped. She thought the contract and the threat of the police would force me to hand over my grandfather's life work. She didn't realize she had literally handed me the one piece of physical evidence that could destroy her entire empire, and I had flash cured it to my assembly table. Thomas, I said, dropping the file on the desk, I need you to watch Lucas for an hour. Keep the doors locked. Don't let anyone in. Where are you going? He asked. I pulled my heavy canvas jacket off the hook by the door. I'm going to make a phone call to a man named Richard Vanderhoof, and then I'm going to renegotiate my lease. I walked into the office, shut the door, and locked it. I sat down at Marcus's desk, the one he had abandoned in a panic just hours ago, and opened the browser on my phone. I didn't try to find Richard Vanderhoof directly. A guy like that, locked in a multi-million-dollar probate war with his stepmother, wouldn't be answering unrecognized numbers. I searched for the lawsuit itself. It took 3 minutes to find a Boston Globe article about the estate dispute. It named the firm representing Richard, Sterling and Hayes. I called their main office. A receptionist answered with a crisp practiced greeting. I need to speak to the lead counsel representing Richard Vanderhoof, I said. I'm sorry, ma'am. The attorneys do not take unsolicited calls. If you'd like to leave a message, tell them I have Charles Vanderhoof 1820 English long case clock. I interrupted, my voice perfectly level. Tell them it was severely damaged, and Eleanor Vanderhoof used a shell company to secretly funnel it into my shop to be repaired off the books so the court wouldn't find out she destroyed an asset belonging to the estate. There was a pause on the line. I could hear the faint clicking of a keyboard stop. Hold please, the receptionist said. I waited. Outside the office window, I could see Thomas standing by the assembly table, his arms crossed, watching the front door like a bouncer. Lucas was back in the old armchair, completely absorbed in his comic book, oblivious to the fact that the ground was shifting under all of us. A minute later, a man's voice came on the line. It was deep, sharp, and impatient. This is David Hayes. Who am I speaking to? My name is Clara Harrison. I operate Elias & Sons Restoration. Eleanor Vanderhoof owns the debt on this building through Heritage Acquisitions, LLC. She brought the clock here this morning to hide it from the probate audit. I have it clamped to my bench. Where are you? He asked. The impatience was gone. Crane Street, the old shop. But you need to get here fast. Eleanor's man, Arthur, was just here trying to force me to sign a contract transferring the intellectual property of my grandfather's business to her trust. If I don't sign it, she's going to evict me and take the clock back. Don't sign anything, Hayes meekly. And do not let them move that clock. Richard and I are in a deposition downtown. We can be there in 45 minutes. Can you keep them out until then? I've got the locks, I said. 45 minutes, he repeated and hung up. I walked back out to the main floor. The liquidators were long gone. The massive footprint where the spray booth used to be was now just a large empty square of clean concrete surrounded by 50 years of accumulated wood dust. The silence in the shop was heavy. Thomas, I said, drop the deadbolts on the front door. Pull the blinds on the bay windows. Thomas didn't ask questions. He walked to the front, flipped the heavy brass levers, and pulled the old canvas shades down, plunging the showroom into a muted amber gloom. Only the harsh white work lights over my bench remained illuminated, casting long shadows from the shattered base of the clock. We waited. I made Lucas a sandwich with the supplies Thomas had brought in his cooler. I sat on my stool, watching the urea resin cure on the mahogany joint. The flash cure was holding beautifully. Grandfather's formula worked exactly the way he had written it in the book that was currently buried under 30 pounds of steel in my toolbox. 40 minutes later, a heavy knock echoed through the showroom. Thomas looked at me. I nodded. He went to the door, pulled the shade back a fraction of an inch, and unlocked it. Two men stepped inside. The first was in a sharp, expensive suit, carrying a leather briefcase. David Hayes. The second man was younger, maybe in his early 40s, wearing a simple raincoat over a sweater. He looked exhausted, the kind of deep, bone-weary exhaustion that comes from fighting your own family for months. Richard Vanderhoof. Richard didn't look at me. He didn't look at Thomas. His eyes locked immediately onto the work light, and he walked straight toward the assembly table. He stopped a few feet away, staring down at the shattered, glued, clamped mess of wood. His breath hitched. My grandfather bought this in London, Richard said, his voice thick. My dad used to wind it every Sunday. He promised it to me when I was 10. He reached out a hand, hovering over the burned crotch mahogany where Marcus's guy had taken the power sander. He didn't touch it. What happened to it? My brother took a chemical stripper and a mechanical sander to it, I said, stepping forward. He didn't know what he was doing. The structural glue failed, and the veneer was destroyed. Eleanor found out yesterday. She bought the debt on this shop to cover it up, locked my brother out, and brought it to me to fix quietly. Hayes set his briefcase on the table and opened it. Do you have the intake receipt your brother filed? The one listing the estate? I handed him the folder pulled from Jane's discarded pile. It's all there. Dated, signed, and linked to Eleanor's account. Hayes reviewed the document, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. Breach of fiduciary duty, gross mismanagement of estate asset, attempted concealment of material facts from a probate judge. He looked at Richard. We have her. If we file this receipt and take possession of the clock, the judge will strip her as the executor of the trust by the end of the week. Richard didn't look triumphant. He just looked sad. Can you fix it? He asked me. I can, I said, but it will take 3 months, and I have a condition. Hayes looked up, his lawyer instincts immediately kicking in. Harrison, we appreciate your cooperation, but the clock is legally evidence in a dispute. I cut him off. But right now, it's also physically flash cured to my workbench with a specialized urea compound. If you try to move it before the inner hide glue cures, it will splinter into 1,000 pieces and it will never ever look the same again. It stays here. Hayes narrowed his eyes. What's your condition? Before I could answer, the sound of a key grinding in the front door echoed through the quiet shop. The heavy brass knob rattled. Then, a sharp, authoritative knock. Clara, Arthur's voice called from the street. Open the door. I looked at Hayes. My condition is that you let me handle this next part. Hayes closed his briefcase. He and Richard stepped back into the shadows near the office door, out of direct sight from the entrance. Thomas walked over and unlocked the front door. Arthur pushed his way in, looking irritated. Eleanor Vanderhoof followed right behind him, her face a mask of cold displeasure. She had her gold-headed cane, tapping it sharply against the floorboards as she walked in. She stopped when she saw the empty space where the spray booth used to be. The equipment has been liquidated, Arthur said, smoothing his tie. The escrow account is funded. Now, Clara, we need the signed operating agreement and the guild notebook. Eleanor has a dinner engagement, and we'd like to conclude this business. I stood by assembly table, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the wood. I'm not signing the agreement, Arthur. Eleanor's pale eyes snapped to me. I beg your pardon? I'm not signing it, I repeated. I'm not giving you the intellectual property of my family, and I'm not running a front for a mass-produced furniture line. Arthur let out a condescending sigh. Clara, we went over this. If you don't sign, the trust forecloses on the building today. The locks get changed. You are evicted. And the clock. The clock belongs to the estate of Charles Vanderhoof, a voice said from the shadows. Eleanor froze. The absolute stillness of her posture was the only indication that she was entirely, fundamentally shocked. Richard stepped out into the light, followed by Hayes. Hello, Eleanor, Richard said quietly. Eleanor's knuckles turned white on the head of her cane. She looked at Richard, then at the clock, and finally she looked at me. The aristocratic detachment was gone. Her eyes were pure, venomous ice. You, she whispered. Me, I said. You bought the debt to hide the fact that you ruined his inheritance. You set up a shell company to steal my family's name to cover your own track. And you thought you could trap me in the middle of it. Hayes stepped forward, his voice ringing with absolute professional authority. Eleanor Vanderhoof, as counsel for the plaintiff, I am formally advising you that we have secured documentation proving your attempt to conceal the destruction of a protected estate asset. We will be filing for an emergency injunction tomorrow morning to have you permanently removed as executor of the trust. Arthur looked at Eleanor, panic finally breaking his smooth veneer. Eleanor, if he files that, the board will freeze the Heritage Acquisitions accounts. We'll lose the backing for the entire overseas manufacturing project. Eleanor didn't look at Arthur. She kept her eyes fixed on me. She was calculating. She was a woman who had never lost a game of leverage in her life, running the math on how to survive this one. What do you want, Richard? She asked, her voice tight but controlled. I want the clock, Richard said, and I want you to step down as executor, voluntarily. You walk away, take your share of the liquid asset, and leave the house and the heritage properties to me. If you do that, we'll file the fraud charges. Eleanor's jaw tightened. She was cornered, but she wasn't looking at Richard. She was still looking at me. And you orchestrated this little ambush. What is your price, Clara? I walked around the table until I was standing directly in front of her. I didn't have a cane. I didn't have a trust fund, but my boots were covered in in sawdust, and I was standing on my grandfather's floor. Heritage Acquisitions owns the lien on this building, I said. Arthur has the paperwork in his briefcase right now. I want you to transfer the deed of this property to me. Free and clear. No mortgage, no profit sharing, no corporate oversight. Arthur scoffed. That's a $2 million commercial property. You're out of your mind. It's a $2 million property, I agreed. But if Hayes files that injunction tomorrow, you lose the trust, you lose the overseas manufacturing deal, and you likely face felony fraud charges for hiding probate assets. So a $2 million building seems like a very cheap price to keep you out of court. Eleanor stared at me. For a second, just a brief second, I thought I saw a flicker of genuine respect in those cold, pale eyes. It was the respect of a predator recognizing that it had just been out-hunted. Arthur, Eleanor said, not breaking eye contact with me. Draft an addendum to the operating agreement. Transfer the deed of the property on Crane Street to Clara Harrison. Full release of the Elias & Sons trademark. Eleanor, you can't be serious. Do it, Arthur, she snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. Now. Arthur scrambled to open his briefcase on the edge of the table, pulling out a pen and scribbling furiously on the legal documents, crossing out the corporate clauses and writing in the transfer of ownership. 10 minutes later, the papers were signed. Eleanor signed them with a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. I signed them with a cheap blue ballpoint I kept in my apron pocket. When it was done, Arthur packed his briefcase, his face pale and sweating. Eleanor buttoned her coat. She didn't say goodbye to Richard. She didn't say a word to me. She turned and walked out the door, her cane tapping a slow, defeated rhythm against the hardwood. The heavy door clicked shut. The silence in the room was entirely different this time. It wasn't heavy. It felt light. It felt like the air pressure had finally equalized. Hayes gathered up the copies of the deed transfer and the intake receipt. We'll file these first thing in the morning. Miss Harrison, the property is legally yours. He looked at the clock. How long did you say? 3 months, I said. I'll do it right. The way it was meant to be done. Richard reached out and gently touched the undamaged brass dial of the clock. Take your time, he said softly. It's been waiting a long time to be fixed. It can wait a little longer. They left a few minutes later, stepping out into the late afternoon light that was finally breaking through the rain cloud. I stood alone in the center of the showroom. Thomas walked over. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his heavy metal scraper, and walked over to the exposed brick wall where Marcus had slapped his cheap white paint. He dug the blade in and scraped. A long curl of white paint fell away, revealing the deep, rich, historical red of the brick underneath. I smiled. I walked over to my rolling toolbox. I opened the bottom drawer, moved the heavy mallets aside, and pulled out the small black leather notebook with the London Guild crest. I ran my thumb over the worn cover. It belonged here. It would never leave this building again. Mom? I turned around. Lucas had finally put his comic book down. He was standing by the old armchair, looking around the massive quiet shop. Are we going back to the mill? He asked. I walked over and knelt down in front of him, wiping a smudge of sawdust off his cheek. I could smell the faint scent of beeswax and linseed oil starting to drift back through the air, replacing the toxic sting of the lacquers. No, Bug, I said, my voice thick but completely steady. We're not going anywhere. We're home.